you're going to have to forgive me, right? Because there is jargon in all of this. And I don't think we can really escape all of that. But, you know, let's see how we get on with it. And John, pick me up on anything. So the governance of a study, okay, it's got to be properly run. And as John says already, it's you know it's got to be open, it's got to be transparent, and it's got to be run in a way that answers questions well. So there is always a sponsor, and that could be a pharmaceutical company, it could be a university, it could be a hospital trust, and this is the legal and financial indemnity for the study. So it's the organization, the body that is ultimately responsible for carrying the can. Very rarely would it be an individual person. Funding could be commercial from a company. It could be a charitable grant, Blood Cancer UK, for example. There is a protocol review and an ethics review, which is at the heart of good research. The MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, and representatives thereof, statisticians, will review the protocol and ensure that it kind of makes sense and will work from the point of view of the nuts and bolts of the study and the statistics of the study. And the HRA Research Ethics Committee is really responsible for reviewing the patient-facing, the participant-facing documentation, for understanding what kind of PPIE involvement there has been, to ensure that the safety, dignity, and welfare of participants is protected at every turn. And that includes their physical and psychological welfare. It also includes looking after, what steps are made to look after their data to ensure privacy. So that's a key step in clinical trials within what we call the Western world. There should be a trials management group, which is an independent body that looks at the safety signals. In other words, what kind of side effects do people have? Put it all together. How do they group? How important are they? How difficult or serious is all of that? Should the study go ahead? And often there are rules built into the study that say whether it can continue or whether it has to stop. And the Data Safety Monitoring Committee will review that on a frequent and regular basis, depending on what's expected and what isn't expected. And there's a response assessment body as well. So it's not just the treating clinicians who are likely to be a bit biased about looking after their patients. There is an independent body that will review what kind of responses people will have. There's a chief investigator, usually for one country. So the UK, if there's a study in the UK, it'll be one particular person in the UK who will be the chief investigator, and they're responsible for the oversight of many centres, the lead investigator for the country. There's a network of principal investigators at each large recruiting site. So, for example, I was a principal investigator at the Leicester site for a number of studies over a long period of time. And we would be responsible for recruiting, for the safe, effective, secure trial delivery at the research site, running a team of co-investigators and admin, clerical, and nursing staff. So the co-investigators, clinicians like myself, who would be working with the principal investigator to deliver the study and look after their own patients within the trial. There are different phases of studies. Now, you may well have heard of these: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, etc. studies. A phase 1 study is usually quite small. It's really all about safety. It's all about trying to understand what the side effects would be, whether a new treatment is safe to use, at what level, how is it metabolized, maybe doing blood tests to see what the levels would be in the blood system. Basically finding the right dosage. It may contain healthy volunteers, it might contain patients, and if it does contain patients, it could be something where people have had maybe several types of therapy before. So this could be potentially one of the few circumstances where it would be one of those last resort studies. But that's quite rare. It'd be unusual to come across a phase 1 study. Phase 2 studies are much more common, maybe a few tens of people, sometimes hundreds of people, and they're enrolled with that particular patient profile. So people with CLL, for example, who've never had treatment, or people with CLL who've had at least one other therapy, or people with CLL with a certain kind of genetic process going on in the cells. So it's that profile of patients that get introduced. And yes, looking for the safety signal, but also very much starting to look for how effective those drugs are. Is it working? Is it doing something? Can we see a difference? And this is where we get into those primary and secondary endpoints. So that's a bit more jargon for you. Primary endpoint might be the top thing we're looking for. And that could be, how long does somebody stay in remission? Or what's the remission rate with this drug? It wouldn't necessarily be how long you live for, but it could be, and that's usually one of the secondary endpoints. But there could be other secondary endpoints as well. And importantly, that's usually where quality of life starts to fit in. And it needs to fit in well and dovetail well with studies. But that would be absolutely built in to pretty much every study nowadays. And it begins, these studies, these smaller studies, phase 2, begin to inform larger scale studies. So that's when we move forward to these phase 3, which are often take many years to complete, often with many hundreds of people. Hugely expensive things to do. And this is where we start thinking about these randomized, placebo-controlled, or possibly open, what we call open label, so you know what it is you're getting. And data is collected over a long period of time and may be submitted to a licensing authority, such as the FDA or the EMA, for approval, for drug approval, for licensing. You'll quite often find that things aren't very commonly placebo-controlled in these studies. So in CLL, in the world of CLL, it's really very unlikely you'd see a placebo-controlled study, because why would we want to give you something that isn't going to work? So sometimes they are, but it's really very unusual. I can't think of a placebo-controlled study. Usually it's the standard of care. In other words, what would have given you anyway? So the whole idea is not, as John says, to lose out in any way, because if there is a potential to lose out, then it's not a good study. So participants should not lose out from being within a clinical trial. Statistics. So endpoints, well, we've talked about this already. So overall survival, that's what we say, is how long someone will actually live for. Progression-free survival, PFS. You might see this if you ever go to one of those meetings where they show you those fancy curves, the Kaplan-Meier curves. Well, quite often down the left-hand side of the plot, you might see PFS, which in other words means how long does somebody stay in remission? So they've had their treatment and then they have the remission before the disease progresses, which is not good. Progression doesn't mean good. It means that it gets worse. It starts to appear again. Event-free, it might be an infection, it might be some kind of cardiac toxicity, it might be some other side effect, or it might be relapse. So event-free survival. And then remission. So that's an area of real interest at the moment. What is remission? What does it mean? How deep should it be? Does it matter how deep it should be? And you may be aware that we can measure levels of CLL cells in the blood, in the bone marrow, down to really very, very low levels indeed. So looking for, a grain of sand. And does that make a difference in terms of the duration of the response? And can we maximize that duration of response without causing too much in the way of side effects? So that balance, I'm sure we'll talk about it. And quality of life, which we've spoken about already and should be absolutely built in. Statistics it's got to work. There's got to be enough people in it, and you've got to expect a big enough effect to be able to measure it. So in other words, what can you measure using mathematical modeling? Going back to 1964, 60 years ago, Declaration of Helsinki. So this is all starting to get to the human rights aspects of protecting people's identities, well-being, welfare, dignity within human research. And this is being refined constantly so that the participants' welfare is looked after at every turn. And, and I think that we're going through a natural evolution, particularly in the partnership between participants and those representing participants, the public, patient groups, and clinical researchers. That partnership, I think, is part of this protection of well-being and ensuring the relevance of studies. So there are statutory laws in the UK which are there to help protect participants, making sure that data is accurate, making sure that it's believable. So the Health Research Authority, the role of the MHRA and the Research Ethics Committees, I think we've touched on this already, but the MHRA will want to know about the risk and the benefit. Is it feasible? Is it practical? Is it scientific? Are they statistics? Do they work out? And the REC will review studies, and we review lots of studies every month, and we quiz the investigators to ensure that things are as they say they are. Is it fair? Is it ethical? And are participants being protected at all times? So you're told about a study and you're given what's likely to be quite a big document these days, or often sort of 20 or 30 pages, might be more, might be less than that. But quite commonly, there's a big document that's given to you to read through. And it's got to be clear, it's got to be transparent, it's got to give the background information. What's it for? Why are we doing this study? And why have I, or why have you been invited to take part? What are the expectations, the risks, the benefits? In studies, when we're reviewing them at the REC, we're often quite wary if a study promises to over-deliver. We usually question that, because if it's a clinical trial, basically we don't know the answer. That's why we're doing a study in the first place. So we cannot promise that it's going to be better. What we can say is that, you know, that you won't lose out, and that to the best of our knowledge and belief, this is a good way forward. So you can't overstate any possible benefit. The PIS, patient information sheet, should contain all the practicalities. Who, what, where, when, how, why, what's going to happen to me? What are the tests? What are the time points? How am I going to get this? Is it a tablet? Is it an injection? What's it all about? Who to contact for further information? Who to complain to as well? How is data protected? What do I do if I don't like it anymore? Can I stop? Who to complain to? And are there any incentives? Sometimes there are Amazon vouchers, or there are arrangements to help with travel expenses. So it has to be reasonable and limited. John will talk about risk and benefits, I'm sure, but risks and benefits, they really have to be foreseen so they can be described. And the burden should be minimized as much as possible, taken out if possible, eliminated, so that the benefits are as enhanced as they possibly can be within the limits of the study. That nobody's going to be disadvantaged by taking part in it. And is there an overall benefit to society for the study? So lots of considerations. Okay, I'm nearly done, I'm sure. And then we'll get on to the proper discussion, because this is really jargon heavy. Adverse events. To us, we record adverse events. To you, this is side effects, things you don't want, things that go wrong. Now, an adverse event could be that you sign the consent form, you haven't had any of the drug yet, but you stub your toe on the way out of the clinic. To us, that's already an adverse event. To you, it's not really a side effect, but we have to record all of that. So everything that happens from the moment of getting into the study, usually from the moment of signing the consent form, checking the eligibility, becomes an adverse event. So it's anything that's unintentional, new problem, new illness, change in blood tests, some kind of deterioration in something. It doesn't have to be related. So that's a key thing. It doesn't have to be related. So it's not necessarily a side effect of the treatment, but something that happens. A serious adverse event might be obviously more serious. It could involve being admitted to hospital or even dying from something that happened from an overwhelming infection, for example, will be an example of a serious adverse event. And there are things that we didn't know about. So you suspect that it might be an unsuspected thing. So suspected, unexpected serious adverse reaction. So something we didn't think would happen, but it has. So we have to capture that too. So there's lots of information that's codified and graded and stratified into how bad it is that we have to do. Now, the consent process, this is really interesting and something that is worthy of, well, a session by itself, I think. It's all related to the quality of the information and being able to make up your own mind with a discussion with family, a discussion with your clinicians, with the specialist nurses maybe, so that you're confident that you understand what's being offered and confident that it's the right thing for you, taking as much time as you need. Usually with CLL, I think we have enough time to be able to weigh things up. Things don't change necessarily too quickly overnight. It's not what we're expecting. Often, and you may have experienced things like this, that things begin to change. You notice that your blood counts are changing. The lymphocyte count is going up, or hemoglobin is beginning to fall. And there's a few shots across the bow before we really need to grasp the nettle and do something. And that's the time to start thinking about what the options are and to talk them through, whether it's something that might be available within a clinical study or whether it's one of the more normal standard of care processes. So how much time do you have? Basically, as much as you need. Can you change your mind? Absolutely. Now, not only can you change your mind, but nobody has to give any reason for that. And we're grown-ups. You can just say, I don't like this. I say to my patients, if you don't like this, just say, Dr. Kennedy, I don't like this anymore. Can we stop? Of course. And it doesn't prejudice any treatment or any other clinical care going forward. Information should be anonymized. It should be kept securely. And there are standards for that. The person taking your consent should be authorized within the study to do so, usually the principal investigator or one of the co-investigators. And there is a profound role for this patient and public group to be able to contribute to the quality of the information around a study. So just a couple of slides on PPIE, good public involvement. It's around, what is the research question? Making sure it's relevant to the people going into the study, not just necessarily relevant to the scientific questions. So it's got to be acceptable to people. There's got to be an informed decision about whether people can go into it, whether the participants will enter it. And that means that it's got to be explained clearly with an appropriate level of detail so that you can make an informed decision. And then later on, there's got to be some kind of expose of the findings. So explaining what happened, and that should be made available. It's not always something we're very good at, but I think it's a work in progress. The Health Research Authority is now expecting that PPIE is taken and used in the development of studies. It's not actually legislated for, so it doesn't have to happen. But when it happens well, sitting in the Research Ethics Committee, we can see that it makes a substantial difference to the clarity and openness, transparency of the information around the study. And there are national standards for all of this, with lots of sources of guidance available. They should be involved in a way that experience that people have with a PPIE group is relevant. There should be enough people involved, and there should be questioning around how the study itself is relevant, acceptable, the risk benefit is right, the quality of the information, and how it's going to be communicated. So making research better, it's all our jobs. I do a very similar talk with the medical students. And I'm getting old now. They're much younger. It's up to them to do this much better than we ever did. So research has got to be trustworthy. It's got to be inclusive, equitable, diverse, so it can reach all corners of the population. Now, real challenge there. It's got to be caring. It's got to be looking after, because we're hardwired to look after people. And research should be no different. Clinical studies should be no different. It should be mutual in the way that communities work together to do this. It should be of value, it should be valuable, and it should make a difference to people, and it should be clear and straightforward. So, real challenge to get the right studies. Science and the priorities of a participant group need to marry up. They need to sustain and nourish each other. There's a huge team of people involved in research. It's not just the company or the sponsor and a principal investigator delivering it. There's a whole range of clinical trials nurses. There are clerical teams, monitors, auditors, sponsors, ethics committees, statisticians, and then in the background, all the laboratory staff, all the radiology staff, people arranging transport of studies, of samples. And then, naturally, without those participants, without patients and without their families, none of that would actually happen. So that's the heart of it. And then closing remarks on this formal section. People often just do better in clinical studies. Just do better. There's a template, there's a guide, you know where you're going, it's predictable. There's a bit more attention to detail. There's a bit more support. There are psychological and potentially physical benefits to it. And there's also a role of that altruistic contribution to understanding. So there's lots of positive things. And on that note, John, I'm going to hand back to you, and thank you. We'll continue our conversation.